Well, we've got another beautiful day that we can assemble together and worship God. And we want to pick up our study in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And we kind of broke right in the middle of verse 5 in our last study. And again, realizing the context here that Paul is encouraging and admonishing the congregation at Corinth, the members, to withdraw, to separate themselves from these false apostles, as well as his admonition to them that they need to come into the obedience of Christ, as what he says in the next verses following here. But he is pointing out, and still he is using this metaphor, this military terminology, and pointing out that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. And so he uses this allusion, this analogy, as a city, a fortress being built, and the strong walls, and the towers, the high towers that they would have in those, and all these things like this. But he's using this terminology that when God's army comes against this fortress, then the weapons, these spiritual weapons, pull down these walls, these strongholds. They cast down the imagination, these false arguments, and these every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. And so these things are brought down. And as I said, he is continuing to use this metaphor of military terminology. And he is by design showing that these false apostles, the fortress, if you will, their false arguments, they will be destroyed by these spiritual weapons that are mighty through God. And he is encouraging them to make these corrections before he comes, so that when he comes, then he can spare the rod, so to speak, and he can come in a spirit of meekness and love. And so then he says here, as we pick up in verse 5, where he says, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. And I want to spend just a little bit of time on thinking about the knowledge of God. Now, when we go back and look at Isaiah 11, for instance, and this was this is when Isaiah foretold the coming of Messiah through the seed of Jesse, and things would take place in that day, as Isaiah says. And he says that in that day they shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Okay, now again, though, it would be in that day, in Messiah's day. Okay, now in Jeremiah 31, now we're familiar with this text here because we have heard this a lot through the years. And this is where Jeremiah was foretelling, God through Jeremiah was foretelling the coming of the new covenant. And he said that it would not be like the covenant that he made with their fathers in the day that he took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. You know, he brought them through the Red Sea and so forth. And he says, which my covenant they broke. So he says, this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my law in their inward parts. I will write it in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now notice what he says. They shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord. Why? For they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord. And I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. Okay, so that was Jeremiah, God through Jeremiah foretelling the coming of this new covenant. But it was dealing with knowledge, okay? And again, then Paul quotes and applies that prophecy in Hebrews chapter 8, saying that in that he says a new covenant, and that's in verse 12, I believe, of Hebrews. I didn't have this verse handy. But he says that which is decaying and waxing old, growing old, is ready to vanish away. So they were about to the point of the transition from the old covenant to the new covenant. But he says, he quotes in verse 11, he quotes from Jeremiah, "They shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord." Well, again, here's this knowledge of the Lord. And of course, as a side note, the reason is everyone in this new kingdom and under this new covenant, they have to already know, they have to have this knowledge before they can be in covenant with God. So that's why he says this. They won't have to run and teach every man his neighbor, because those already in covenant, that's what it's talking about under the new covenant, they're already going to know. Okay, so again, thinking about this knowledge, because Paul says here in our text, every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. And we remember that in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Jesus predicted, he foretold, he said, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, then shall the end come." Of course, that's the end of Judaism, the end of the covenant, the Jewish age. Okay, that's the only end that's being talked about in that text, is the end of the Jewish age. So, as Jesus foretold here, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world. So, well, this is how this knowledge is going to go into all the world. It's going to be spread, okay? And so then, as a for instance, here we look at Romans 10 and verse 18. Paul says, just after he has quoted Isaiah, he says, "But I say, have they not heard? Yes, verily, their sound went into all the earth, and their words unto the ends of the world." And so this knowledge of God was growing. And then we look at what Paul says in Ephesians 3, verses 3 and 4. Paul says, how that by revelation, now remember that Paul said that the gospel that he preached, he wasn't taught it of man, but it came by a direct revelation from Jesus Christ. It was Galatians chapter 1. So he says here, how that by revelation he, Christ, made known unto me the mystery, as I wrote afore in few words. Now notice, whereby when you read, you may understand my knowledge in the mystery of Christ. So we have a lot of texts which predict that this knowledge would increase. We have texts, and there's more, this is just a sample, that we have these texts that show and demonstrate that this knowledge of God was increasing, particularly during the ministry of Paul. And at another place he says, "I have fully preached the gospel unto you." We'll see that in the next verses. I've got that note here somewhere in these verses. But what he is showing here is that when these false apostles would set themselves against the knowledge of God, then they're going to be cast down, because that's what he says, casting down imaginations, and so it's casting down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. So he says then, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Well, when we think about this captivity, bringing into captivity, we see a primary application in the context of what he's referring to regarding the false apostles. And so I also want to look at a couple of other places. For instance, in Romans 7, verse 22, Paul says, "For I delight in the law of God after the inward man." All right, then he would write in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, "But I keep under my body and bring it into subjection lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. So he delights in the law of God after the inward man. Okay? And then with the thought of bringing into captivity every thought. Even Paul says, and another text that I could have used very good right here was where he says, the things that I know to do, I don't do, and the things that I know I shouldn't do, those are what I do. And I have a law in my members, the spirit warring against the flesh, and that would fit right here perfectly. And so, but he says right here, I keep under my body. So if Paul, being filled with the Holy Ghost and having the supernatural powers that he was endowed with, if he says, I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, infers or implies that there's some effort involved in this. This wasn't something that came naturally to Paul. And if it didn't come naturally to Paul, who had the baptismal measure of the Holy Spirit, then it's not going to come naturally to any of us. That's something we have to work at. And so, and that's how I'm trying to get at a secondary application here with the idea of bringing into captivity every thought. And so, as Paul says, that he has to keep under his body, bring into subjection his body, and then realizing that God is number one, so to speak. Paul says, I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. So that shows the order, if you will, the headship order, that is God, Christ, man, and woman. And so in honoring these things, then we have to work at bringing our body into subjection. And that's kind of why I brought in 1 Corinthians 11 verse 3 was on the idea of subjection. Christ it was in subjection to God the Father. Man is to be in subjection to Christ, and woman is to be in subjection to the man. And that's just the way God set it up. And so, again, bringing into captivity every thought, he says, to the obedience of Christ. Well, Paul wrote to the Romans in chapter 6, and he said, know you not that to whom you yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants you are to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. But God be thanked that you were the servants of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. Being then made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. And so, with this thought of bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ, Paul is, again, encouraging and admonishing the Corinthians that they need to separate themselves from these false apostles, and that they need to use these weapons, even as Paul is saying that he does, to pull down these strongholds and cast down these false arguments, to cast down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. That's what these false prophets, these false apostles rather, this is what they were doing. They were exalting themselves against the knowledge of God. And so he is encouraging them to withdraw, separate from them, and to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. And so in thinking about the obedience of Christ, that's what Paul is saying to the Romans there in chapter 6. Whoever you yield yourselves servants to, that's who you're going to obey. So he's encouraging the Romans that they are to be servants to God, yield themselves servants to God, to be obedient unto righteousness. So as he says here in our text, verse 5, to be obedient to the obedience of Christ. And he says in verse 6 then, and having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when, now notice that, when your obedience is fulfilled. So again, this is why I say that he is encouraging them, don't listen to these false apostles, withdraw from them, separate from them. That's when their obedience is going to be fulfilled, is when they do that. He's encouraging them to do that. But notice that he says, and having in a readiness to revenge or avenge all disobedience. So Paul says in chapter 13 of this letter, he says, I told you before and foretell you as if I were present the second time. And being absent now, I write to, now notice, I write to them which heretofore have sinned, and to all other, that if I come again, I will not spare. Now notice that. He says, just like I told you before, I'm telling you again, even as if I were there. I'm writing to all of you. Get this straightened up, because if I come, and obviously you haven't done this, then I will not spare. In verse 10 of that letter, or excuse me, of that chapter, he says, therefore I write these things being absent, lest being present I should use sharpness according to the power which the Lord hath given me, to edification and not to destruction. Now remember, in our previous studies, I've pointed out this power that Paul has, that the apostles have. They had a supernatural power, and there are instances, there are records in the New Testament of where they use this power. And we'll look at a couple of them as we go along. But he's telling them that you need to get this straightened up, because if I come, I'm not going to spare. And so he says, having in a readiness to avenge all disobedience. Well, I want to notice an example here in Numbers chapter 16. Now, obviously I'm not going to take time to read the whole text. That's something that I encourage us all to do, on our own time. But what happened was there were a group of men during the time of Moses who withstood Moses. They said, they tried to say, well, that's too much for you to have to do all this by yourself. We're going to help. And they were not of the tribe of Levi. So God had not authorized that. Now, here's what happened. In Numbers 16, verse 26 beginning, and he, Moses, spake unto the congregation, saying, depart, I pray you, from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing of theirs, lest you be consumed in all their sins. So they got up from the tabernacle of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram on every side, and Dathan and Abiram came out and stood in the door of their tents, and their wives, and their sons, and their little children. And Moses said, hereby you shall know that the Lord hath sent me to do all these works. For I have not done them of mine own hand. Now notice what he says. If these men die the common death of all men, or if they be visited after the visitation of all men, then the Lord hath not sent me. But if the Lord make a new thing, and the earth open her mouth and swallow them up with all that appertain to them, and they go down quick into the pit, then you shall understand that these men have provoked the Lord. So notice what he's saying here. He says, no, if they just die naturally, die a common death, then you'll know what I'm telling you is wrong. But if something spectacular happens, if some spectacular death or whatever happens, then you're going to know that they've provoked the Lord, that I'm not just doing this on a whim out of my own imagination. All right, now when we continue the text, it says, And it came to pass, as he had made an end of speaking all these words, that the ground clave asunder that was under them, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah, and all their goods. They and all that pertained to them went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed upon them, and they perished from among the congregation. And all Israel that were round about them fled at the cry of them, for they said, Lest the earth swallow us up also. And there came out a fire from the Lord, and consumed the 250 men that offered incense. And so we see here in this example that what God did verified what Moses said. And it proved that what these men had done, which was not something God had ordained, he had not authorized them to do that, it showed that that provoked the Lord. And see, that's the same thing that these false apostles were doing. They were setting themselves against the knowledge of God. They were doing things and saying things and preaching things and writing letters, posing as apostles, and doing things that were not ordained of God. And that was provoking God to anger. And so that's why Paul says, and having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. All right, now let's look at another text here, and this is in the New Testament. And we'll go there to read the length of it. In Acts chapter 5, But a certain man named Ananias and Sapphira, his wife, sold a possession, and kept back part of the price, his wife also being privy to it, and brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled thine heart to lie to the Holy Ghost, and to keep back part of the price of the land? While it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was it not in thine own power? Why hast thou conceived this thing in thine heart? Thou hast not lied unto men, but unto God. And Ananias, hearing these words, fell down and gave up the ghost. And great fear came on all them that heard these things. And the young men arose, wound him up, and carried him out, and buried him. And it was about the space of 3 hours after, when his wife, not knowing what was done, came in. And Peter answered unto her, Tell me whether you sold the land for so much. And she said, Yea, or yes, for so much. Then Peter said unto her, How is it that you have agreed together to tempt the Spirit of the Lord? Behold, the feet of them which have buried thy husband are at the door, and shall carry thee out. Then fell she down straightway at his feet, and yielded up the ghost. And the young men came in, and found her dead, and, carrying her forth, buried her by her husband. And great fear came upon all the church, and upon as many as heard these things. So again, here we have another demonstration of the power of God. Now again, this was nothing of Peter's own doing, but it was through Peter, but it was the power of God. And we see here, and when we look at what took place, that these two individuals agreed together to lie about what they were giving. They wanted to have the appearance of selling a possession and then giving all of that amount to the work of the church while they kept back part of it. And so that's why Peter specifically asked her, Tell me whether you sold the land for this amount. And she said yes. So she directly, blatantly lied about that. And so we see that God avenged this sin, and we see the result of that the great fear came upon all the church, and as many as heard these things. And I wonder if the fear was any different there than in the time of Moses and the example that we looked at there. I would feel safe in saying that any time that man has been presented with such a demonstration of the power of God, that there would be great fear on the people for, quite some time. And so, even back when this took place, it's quite a few years following, maybe 25 years later, 20 to 25 years later, and of course in a different place too, that Paul is writing to these Corinthians here and telling them and warning them, don't listen to these false apostles. Don't let them fool you and mislead you because of the appearance of what, of their appearance, of how it looks to them. And again, thinking about the appearance, that's what Ananias and Sapphira, they wanted to have the appearance of giving all the amount, and they lied about it. And of course, that's in the next verse when he talks about the outward appearance. And I'm probably not going to get into that because there's quite a bit more I want to say about that idea of looking on things after the outward appearance. And so he says then, again in verse 6, having in a readiness to avenge or revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. And again, Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 21, what will you? Shall I come unto you with a rod, or in love and in the spirit of meekness? So again, Paul is admonishing them to make these corrections, to don't listen to these false apostles, don't allow them to mislead them. Don't let these false apostles mislead you and trick you into doing something that is against the knowledge of God. Because when I come, if these things are not corrected, then I'll not spare. And again, in another place that we've looked at in the previous lessons, he said, that's why I have not come to you yet, because I'm giving you time to make these corrections. And so he says then that he is ready. He is standing at the ready to avenge all disobedience when their obedience is fulfilled. And so we're going to stop our study here at the end of verse 6. And as I said, when we look at the next verse, when he says, do you look on things after the outward appearance? And see, he had already said in verse 1, I, Paul, myself, beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence, and that's the same word, I believe, presence and appearance, the same prosopon there. And so we'll get into more of a study on looking on things after an outward appearance, because like I said, there's more things I want to bring into this particular point of the study. And so we will conclude our study then here with verse 6.